The next category, Tim, and this is another category which could easily have been blurred together with the art pop and the post-punk fallout category. Gothic architect. Now, I know for a fact that Brendan Perry of Dead Can Dance would probably hate the idea that he's goth, but lots of people would think Dead Can Dance are the epitome of goth. Why would they be goth? Why would they be goth?
I think partly they were on 4AD, partly it was the image that they had, and partly because, of course, there is a kind of gloomy, ghostly quality to their music. It fits in with a gothic sensibility, and I suppose it's a bit like psychedelia, that you can describe certain things that define some goth cliched bands, but actually a lot of the goth bands are very different from one another, as in all genres. You know, a lot of prog bands are different from one another, a lot of psychedelic bands are different from one another, use different processes. To be fair, they started off in a more obvious Joy Division influence territory, so I guess they partly come from that. I mean, there's also a tribal element to the drums as well that fitted in with some of the post-punk sensibility. I mean, I was going to say non so goth as I remember once going to, I think it's possibly in Bielefeld in Germany, going to a dark wave goth club around Christmas, and there was a Santa Claus with a black Santa Claus outfit dancing to DAF or something like that. But that's very rigid way.
But that's second generation goth, isn't it? That's when goth has become. It's become a meme. Is meme the right word? It's become a thing, and there are things. But all of
stylistic tropes. It's like,
stylistic tropes.
You know, neo prog has the stylistic tropes of the progressive underground bands that actually very few of them had.
Yes, or if they did have them, it was almost they stumbled on them by accident
and left it for one album.
Yes.
You know.
So I think we can safely say the same is true probably of the first generation of what we now think of as goth. I've got Cocteau Twins in this category.
Bauhaus fit into it, Joy Division to
Sisters of Mercy is probably the band I would think most accurately reflects what we think of as the goth
But
tropes.
even then, you know, by 1987, they had a sense of excess and humour that was not what you'd say is definitive goth. But I mean, Spleen and Ideal, is it?
What an album. Yeah, what an album.
I love it.
Second album. This is the album where they really become Dead Can Dance, isn't it?
Well, it might be my favourite of theirs because it's where everything's quite tentative. It comes out just after this Mortal Coil album, which I loved, you know, the first This Mortal Coil album, It'll End in Tears. And Lisa Gerrard, I guess, gained some prominence through being on that. So I bought this, you know, in eager anticipation from my hour price in Warrington. Absolutely adored it. And I think there's a kind of, with this, there's still a connection between the band they were, which is that band coming out of Joy Division and Trouble.
Yes.
I think by the next, Within the Realm of a Dying Sun, they've become something altogether other. But by this, you can just about see them coming out of a post-punk sensibility. It's got a rawness, a roughness, guitars, and certainly Brendan's croon isn't as defined as it's going to become.
But it starts with these two instrumental pieces that sound like colossal pieces of music of worship almost. It's got that, it's so over the top and portentous and pretentious in all the best possible senses of the word. Which must have been quite shocking for people that had been buying Bauhaus records and Sisters of Mercy records, you know, and thinking that this is going to be the next definitive piece of goth music they're going to put on their turntable.
But it went down well, and they did have quite a global audience, I think, because, you know, there was a lot of instrumental music, and, you know, Lisa Gerrard would sing wordlessly, a la the Cocteau Twins in some ways. They had a sort of enormous following in America, Canada. I was always really surprised that you'd talk to people and go, oh, Dead Can Dance, magnificent. So I think they also kind of got in with the nascent world music and maybe even the new age that was kind of dominating culturally. They got in with some of that.
And I think neoclassical music as well. There's as much Arvo Pärt about this record as there is Joy Division.
I think Arvo Pärt is a good comparison.
Yeah. And it's ludicrous, isn't it? And we love ludicrous music. It's so unapologetically what it is. It's reaching for the star. I mean, you know, there's a picture of actually someone, it's a great cover as well, isn't it? Picture of what looks like somebody out of focus holding up a star. There is a sense of it reaching for something so high and risking everything and looking ridiculous.
Well, talking of Gothic, it reminds me, have you ever been to Cologne Cathedral?
Yes.
This enormous cathedral?
Yes.
That's where this music fits.
Yes.
Nico, to a certain extent.
Yes.
If Nico's in the basement of the cathedral, they're actually screaming at us from the top.
Nico's buried in a coffin in the crypt.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a sense of reverential religiosity to the music, isn't
Very
there?
much,
I don't
yeah.
think they are religious, but it's got that kind of passion that religious people have about their music. It's pretty humorless, isn't it?
Well, you can't imagine
Pretty
that they
humorous.
were watching Carry On Cabby while making this album.
No, but I love that about it. And then their label mates, Cocteau Twins, who didn't make an album this year, but Cocteau Twins have developed this tradition of releasing at least 2, sometimes 3, 4-track EPs every year. And I think for me, their best work sometimes would be on their EPs. And they released 3 this year. The Aikea-Guinea EP, 4 tracks, and then a pair of companion releases that came out the same day, essentially an album's worth of material that was split over 2 matching 4-track EPs, Tiny Dynamite and Echoes in a Shallow Bay. And again, you wonder, goth, you know, I mean, okay, they're a bit humorless. They almost had an anti-image in that respect, didn't they? Liz Fraser always looked embarrassed to be performing, and it was part of their charm, you know. And the use of reverb and echo and depth and ambience in the music.
What links Dead, because I think Dead Can Dance are much darker than Cocteau Twins.
Yes.
But what they both possess is an ethereal spiritual
sense
quality.
of space. Yeah. Sisters of Mercy, we mentioned their debut album First and Last and Always came out this year. I mean, this in many ways, this is the definitive goth album. I think partly because his voice, he's got that baritone voice. And the titles are ridiculous.
It's like Bowie meets Bela Lugosi, isn't it? There's something there.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. It's a definitive goth statement. I probably prefer Floodland, but
Me too.
I really like this. And strangely, it's one of those albums, a bit like U2, where, you know, you hear, and I said obviously Frozen Moment by Roy Harper, where suddenly I think, geez, that's a key influence on me without me ever realising when I was listening to this album, because I was aware of it at the time. And it wouldn't have been my favourite album of 85. I'd have really liked it and I'd have played it. And I was listening to tracks like Walk Away and thought, good God, there are elements of that in Swagger by No Man that, you know, I'd clearly absorbed it. And I do remember, you know, it's my dad, very supportive, when he was watching Top of the Pops and bands like The Mission and the Sisters of Mercy would come on, he'd say, "You bloody sound like that, bloody awful."
Really? That was...
Yeah, and he'd heard something in The Mission and Sisters of Mercy, and then...
You sound like that, bloody awful.
You sound like that, bloody awful. And then we'll be quaking with the rage. I thought, well, that's very supportive, thank you very much.
Okay.
As a Roger Moore retort, obviously.
Now, continuing on this theme of what is really goth. Okay, Killing Joke and The Cult both made records this year. And interesting, both records which were their stab at moving further into a mainstream. I love Killing Joke, you know. There's a rage, isn't there, always in jazz, Coleman. And not only in his voice, but also in the rhythm section and in Geordie's guitar. Geordie recently passed away, sadly. That sound, colossal sound. I think we've talked about Killing Joke on the show before. I think this is my favourite Killing Joke record because it's the one where, again, we've talked about this so many times on the show, where they're actually going for a slightly more accessible sound, but they're not losing any of what makes them special.
I mean, Love Like Blood was everywhere at the time, and it is a great single.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of those singles that has got so much economy because it's just a little hook on the guitar that grabs you.
Yeah.
In the same way that something like Shine You Crazy Diamond does. It's that memorable, that simple, and it was everywhere in the clubs at the time because, again, it has that almost running up that hill, pummeling, galloping.
It's a great rhythm. And also 80s, of course, famously, they sued Nirvana for plagiarising 80s on Come As You Are.
Yeah, I'm with you. I really like it because basically
album.
they've managed to soften what they do, make it radio palatable, audience friendly.
Pull out the hooks.
Without losing one iota of their madness. I mean, I quite like Outside the Gate, the one that came 3 years after this. But that's really insane and bloated.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that, you know, they didn't, you know, because this, again, what they could have done after Love Like Blood is just make Love Like Blood for the rest of their careers. And they didn't. They continued to morph, you know.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, Nighttime it's their 5th album, I think I'm right saying. It's almost like it's the logical next step from everything that came before. Because it is, at the end of the day, if you analyse the DNA of the record, it's the same as the first few records, but it's just got a slightly more polished production. It's got a little bit more emphasis on the bringing out the hooks, bringing out the melodicity, which was always there. But as you say, the quirks and the madness is still there too. And I think you could say the same with The Cult, Love. I mean, the big single on this record, She Sells Sanctuary. The Cult would eventually end up morphing essentially into AC/DC. And there's a sense that I think that's what they always wanted to be. I think Ian Astbury, the singer, always wanted to be Jim Morrison. and a big sort of, rock Lothario. But they came, the Cult started out Southern Death Cult, then became Death Cult, then became the Cult. This was their second record. I think She Sells Sanctuary is a brilliant single. I don't know about you.
Yeah, and I quite liked it.
Yeah.
I wasn't as much of a fan. I really liked Sisters of Mercy. Cult were not quite up there for me, but yeah, I liked it. But what's interesting, what you're saying there is that I think with Sisters of Mercy, The Mission, The Cult, to an extent, there was almost a reinvention of the hard rock template. As much as being definitive goth bands, rock fans really like those bands as well.
Is there a sense that Jim Morrison is very much a role model for the goth? The sort of goth look, the goth feeling, the goth image, isn't it? The black leather trousers, the eyeballs, the looking into the empty eyeballs, that deep stare, the nihilistic lyrics. It's all there, isn't it? Really, in the Doors template. And Ian Astbury, of course, famously ended up joining the Doors as a replacement for Jim Morrison.
Yeah, he replaced Jim Morrison.
But apparently, he made quite a creditable go of it. A thankless task. But anyway, now Nick Cave, Tim. Nick Cave, is he goth? I don't know, but I tell you this: I know Nick Cave. I can't remember if we've talked about Nick Cave before on the show. I know Nick Cave is brilliant.
Yeah.
I know he is a genius. I know he's one of the greatest artists of the last 50 years. Never liked him.
So he's a bit of a PJ Harvey for you?
He's a bit on the PJ Harvey side, the Bob Dylan, the Leonard Cohen, the Johnny Cash. Yeah. And actually, interestingly, I think there's a lot in common. He has a lot in common with those artists. I think he's a big Johnny Cash.
I can see that.
He's very influenced by Johnny Cash, isn't he? Yeah. Maybe something about the voice, the mannerisms, that deep kind of baritone voice. I've tried with Nick Cave. I think he's amazing. I've just never really. He's a blank spot for me, and I think, and it's my bad completely. Anyway, his second album, Firstborn, is.
And I've got a lot more time for him, and I think the Bad
you have,
Seeds are an amazing band, very flexible. And what I love about Cave is that not only has he made this kind of proto goth with the Birthday Party, absolute slab of atonal noise. He can also pull off the beautiful ballads. There's quite a number of albums which are quite stately. Yeah. And of late, he's even, experimented with a lot of electronics and does it very, very well. His sound never sits still.
I bought Skeleton Tree, was it recently? And I thought, that's really good. And then I realised I wasn't going to listen to it again. And again, it's my bad. It's absolutely my bad, because I think he's incredible. He's a great writer. He's a very, very smart guy too. It just, for me personally, never really.
Well, he never. I think what I like about him is he never phones it in.
He never phones it in, and he never stands still either, from what I can tell. He's always curious and he's always moving forward. So the second record, Firstborn is Dead, came out. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. This album we do have to talk about, Tim, and I think this is an album that you hate.
Go on.
But I think it's a very important record. And at the time, you will remember this. This was a lot of the hipster press's album of the year.
I'm going to hate it for sure.
You're going to hate it. You know what it is, don't you? The Jesus and Mary Chain, Psychocandy. Now, I remember when this came out, and I have to say, I was pretty blown away with Never Understand particularly.
Yeah.
I don't think the band have really ever transcended their status as indie darlings. They've never done what some of these other bands we've talked about. They've never really crossed over and made a great sort of crossover record. They've kind of carved out their own little niche. But in a sense, I think they do suffer from Citizen Kane syndrome, is that everything that people love them for was defined on this first record. In fact, everything people love them for was kind of defined on the first couple of singles.
You see, I'm thinking that the first singles were slightly more interesting than the album as a whole.
Yeah,
just as an idea.
I think so too.
And funny enough, I remember, I don't know, it was on the Tube or something, Pete Townsend was being interviewed. And the thing is, you listen to Pete's music, and while you can hear that he's got the certainly in his vision, he was saying Jesus and Mary Chain, absolutely phenomenal. So he was talking about the time, they kind of transcended culture, and even elder statesmen were talking about them. But yeah, they're one of those bands, a bit like Teenage Fan Club, that, Nick Cave is for you. Nick Cave is a blank spot for you. They're a blank spot for me. It just kind of chordally sounds quite dull. I love the idea of it. I love this idea of sweet Beach Boys melodies being swamped by My Bloody Valentine or Crimson-esque noise or
Well, it was beyond that.
Chaos,
it was pure feedback. And I think that was what blew my mind with that, particularly that single Never Understand, is there was this beautiful melodic singing going on over this sort of like Motornik, very Velvet Undergroundy beat, with this Phil Spector production. I mean, big reverb, and then this ear-splitting, ugly feedback over the top. I just thought that was so interesting.
In principle, I love it, and as an approach, it's something.
But it's a
I'd want to use.
But it's a flashbulb moment. It's a flashbulb moment. It's like, that's your flashbulb moment. Now, what are you going to do?
Right.
And they never really did anything else that made me sit up that way again, because in a sense, they told their gag. Right. You know, to use the analogy of a comedian, they told their one joke. That was it. Let's take a complete diversion into somewhere completely different now. Now, I've called this category Old Souls. And what I mean by that is that this is the sound of pop music that sounds like it's longing for another era. Sting's first solo album falls into this category for me. Now, we've talked about Sting twice already because he's on the Miles album and he's on the Dire Straits album. Yeah. But he released his first solo album this year, The Dream of the Blue Turtles, which I think is a great, really, really fantastic solo record. But there's something about it that you always knew that Sting was closer to Phil Collins than he was to Johnny Rotten.
Yeah.
And here is the proof on his first solo album. That's very unfair. But do you know what I mean by that? There's something about it, something about him that was close to wanting to be a classic.
I do. And having heard his early demos, I don't know if you ever heard his the band he was in, the jazz rock band he was in before he joined the Police.
No, I haven't heard them.
And they were really interesting. But what's even more interesting is, one, he's got his voice. In 1975, he is Sting.
Right.
Number two, in 1975, he's writing the melodies for things that are going to be hits for the Police and Sting as a solo artist.
Right.
You know, some of things like Children's Crusade, I think.
Oh, yeah, which is on this record.
We Work the Black Seam.
Also
I
on
think
this record.
Essentially, the melodies come from this period.
Great
so he was
songs.
writing this stuff in the mid-70s. And he was, I remember, obsessed with the likes of Jack Bruce and so on, which again puts him as a kind of, as you say, the old soul. I think his heroes growing up were Hendrix, Cream, and so on. And there was always a musicality about the Police, and there's an even greater musicality about the Sting albums. And I agree with you. I think a bit like Phil Collins' Face Value, and at the time, before it became the megastar Sting, he was getting front page of the music papers, and actually it got pretty good reviews when it came out.
Well, the Police,
the
Police were seen as a post-punk group, weren't they? You know,
they were
coming out of the sort of crucible.
Some people
of
didn't
punk.
quite trust them.
Well, I can understand why. I mean, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Those Police records are so good.
They're great.
It doesn't matter what you think. But what's interesting is that this is even a big transition from, say, Synchronicity.
Very
the
much
last
so.
Police
Well,
record.
I was saying Face Value because a bit like Face Value, it's almost like Collins advertising all aspects of his ability. From soul artist to R&B pumper to experimental sound designer. There's everything in that album. It's almost like this is what I can do. 11 songs with 11 different directions. This is sort of similar, where you've got him as the jazz crooner, him as the art rocker, him as the pure pop composer. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in it, and obviously an overriding jazz.
I was going to say, you mentioned
well.
jazz, and I think that's the big difference. That you don't hear jazz in Synchronicity, the previous Police album, but suddenly Sting's on his own, and that jazz sensibility is coming right through. I mean, I think the record he made after this, Bring on the Night.
Oh, yeah, which is really good.
And and I think the band he put together is all a bunch of jazzers, isn't it? Isn't Wynton Marsalis in that band?
It's Branford.
Branford Marsalis. Wynton Marsalis is the big brother, isn't it? Branford Marsalis. And it's essentially a jazz combo. And they're doing like jazzed up versions of a lot of the Police songs. And so you...
Like Bring on the Night itself.
Bring on the Night. So I think... So here, The Dream of the Blue Turtles, you'll hear the beginning of that. In fact, the title track is basically a jazz instrumental, if I'm not wrong. But some great songs on this record. You mentioned some of them, some of his classic, melodic pop singles are on this first album.
If You Love Somebody.
If You Love Somebody. Fortress Around My Heart. I love that song. Dexys Midnight Runners, Tim. Now, I've got a hunch you're going to be very defensive of this record. It's a massive folly.
Yep.
It was slaughtered on release, but it has a real cult following, to the point that it's been reissued in a director's cut, and Ken Rona's gone back and remixed it and resequenced it. I've tried to like it over the years. In fact, I bought it at least twice.
Yeah.
And I just can't find my way into it. I can't find my way into it. I thought maybe you were going to be one of those people that would evangelise
I'm sort of
about
with you.
it.
I've got a couple of friends who absolutely
Yeah, we need to get one of those
adore it.
people on.
And I do think it's interesting. And obviously,
interesting, yeah.
it is certainly the definition of wayward, you know, to
mad.
follow on the two Rye,
Yeah.
Come On Eileen,
Yeah.
era-defining hits. You know, Jackie Wilson, so which I always like, you know, the Top of the
Jockey
Pops story.
Wilson.
Jockey Wilson were apparently on Top of the Pops. And I don't know whether it was the Top of the Pops editors or, right, you know, I think he always said around that it was them that at the back of Jackie Wilson said you had Jockey Wilson, the darts
For those
player.
people who don't know, that are not British, Jockey Wilson was a famous British darts player.
Yeah.
And erroneously, Top of the Pops projected an image of Jockey Wilson while Dexys Midnight Runners were performing their cover of Van Morrison's Jackie Wilson Said. I always like to think that someone had got upset. Kevin Rowland had upset one of the production team at Top of the Pops, so they did it deliberately to piss him off.
He does sound like he could do that.
I think he could upset a few people.
So yeah, this album you're talking about, 85, it was one of those extraordinary albums that bore little relationship to what they'd done. I mean, there was maybe a little bit of the R&B. I think, isn't Vincent Crane from Atomic Rooster on organ on this album?
Possibly,
as well?
but the bits I listened to, it sounded like he was harking back to almost a 40s, 50s again. You know, a bit like with the Sting. There's a strong connection back to jazz, but more old fashioned. Like,
is this the one that's got a lot of talking on it as well?
It's got a lot of talking and almost like a musical. Yeah. What's she like? The 12-minute centerpiece.
That is bizarre.
Really odd. This guy, one of the other guys in the band is asking Kevin, what's she like, this new girl of yours? And then it's very sort of like, Rodgers and Hammerstein, sort of music. Is that the guys that did the musicals?
They did. Yeah.
It's reminding me of that kind of thing. Which I'm sure at the time must have seemed like a really bold, mad thing to do. Does it make it any good? I don't know.
I'm not sure. I think it's one of those. We were talking, I think in '68, you'd asked me about the Jazz and Fripp album, and I said, does that come in that Academy of Underrated for me, where if they'd have ended on that, would we still be talking about it? No. And I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
And I think with this album, it was maybe because it was coming off the back of enormous success, was such a disaster. That's the talking point.
It was seen as admirable.
Yeah.
Retrospectively, it was seen as admirable that they committed this career folly, suicide.
It's the Heaven's Gate of albums in a way. And I'm not sure if it had been their only album and been released in isolation, whether anyone would be talking about it other than it's very odd.
Possibly not. Yeah.
But like you, it's never, I'm really glad it's out there. And I think that Roland, is quite a fascinating artist, and he's got such a distinctive voice as well.
And we know that there are people out there that do love this record and will evangelise about it. So I was hoping you would be one of those people, so you could balance things out. But you're not.
I'm not.
So we need to get someone on.
Like you, I bought it a few times thinking, this is going to be my favourite album of all time.
Now's the time.
Now! And then...
Oh, yeah. So I'm sure there'll be
What's
people...
she like? I might giggle at that.
I'm sure there'll be people on social media that will respond that we're missing everything about this record. It's a masterpiece. And we should get... This is why we should have the 15-second readers' reviews.
We should have the readers' reviews. We should indeed.
Yeah. Listeners' wives, yeah. Suzanne Vega, another old soul. This very young singer-songwriter. I think she was about 20 years old when she made her first album.
Was she? Okay.
And... Again, she's kind of an anachronism at this time, isn't she? She's harking back to the era of your Jonies, your classic Joni Mitchells. A young lady with an acoustic guitar and a very earnest, lyrical, approach. And this was a big hit, this record. And there was obviously an appetite for this kind of record at this time. We have it. Our young daughter, Yali, our eldest, she loves Suzanne Vega.
I mean, I love it. I loved it. I bought this album at the time, loved it then, love it now. I think there is something 80s about it. I mean, it was produced, I think, by Lenny Kaye, wasn't it, from the Patti Smith
You might
group.
be right, yeah.
And I think a bit like the Roy Harper album, because that Roy Harper album is classic Harper, but as you've said, it's got this glassy 80s production on the acoustic guitar, which I think was an Ovation guitar or something. This album, there's a sense of space, and the guitar sound that's very mid-80s. So while it's not cluttered with horribly dated drum sounds or obvious 80s touches, there's something in the space of the music, the sound of the guitar, that again, to use, I think, it reminds me a bit of like Michael Hedges or Ralph Towner or ECM or Windham Hill, of that kind of era. There's a sense of space in the music. Once more, she's got a very sensitive, subtle band behind her on occasion.
Right.
And sometimes, a bit like with Frozen Moment on the Roy Harper album, there are pieces that have got very few chords, but they're beautifully articulated. And it allows her kind of, I don't know how you describe that voice. Again, it's kind of quite warm, quite breathy, quite a sense of space in the way in which she sings every melody. You know, if you're thinking of Marlene on the Wall, in a way was the outlier in that it had the hook, and I guess dragged people into the album.
But she is out of time, isn't she? Because she's doing that Joni thing. She's telling the story. She's got the acoustic guitar. She's storytelling. And you'd think in 1985 that would have been not what people wanted to hear. And yet this album did kind of resonate and did hit, and actually started a trend for...
I think you're right. I think this was the beginning of a trend. You know, I think people like Tanita Tikaram
Tracy
come out
Chapman,
of this. Tracy Chapman, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think this is still one of the most special albums. Like, you know, if you think of Small Blue Thing, you know, it could only be Suzanne Vega. You know, there's only one kind, I don't even think it's a misstep, but there's one track, Neighborhood Girls, where I think she's trying on that kind of Lou Reed street observations, and it doesn't kind of suit her voice as much as the more poetic and elliptical work in the rest of the album. And Marlene on the Wall kind of suits her and suits Your Old Soul's description, in the sense that, you know, this seemed like somebody with an acoustic guitar watching black and white film noirs or comedy films from the 30s. There's something about her that seemed quite knowing, I think.
Now, talking of old souls, Tim,
we
need to talk about this record. Meat is Murder, the Smiths. We love the Smiths, don't we?
And this is a good one.
We love them. Well, they never made a bad one, did they?
I think the first album, which is great, is as close as they come.
It's not as bad.
No,
that's
great.
what I mean. It's not bad. It's great. That's it. But I agree with you. It's my least favourite. But this is definitely a step up from that, isn't it? Morrissey, they're talking old souls. This is an old man in a young man's body, isn't it? Morrissey. So this is, you know, I love the whole thing I love about the Smiths is the reason they're called the Smiths is because Morrissey was looking at all these flock of seagulls, orchestral manoeuvres in the dark, all these very pretentious, you know, multisyllabic band names, and thought, what's the most banal name we can possibly get? The Smiths, okay. And there's something about that that kind of comes through in the music as well. In a sense, this is quite reductive, isn't it? This is a return to guitar, bass, drums, almost a 60s, you know, pre-Beatles almost.
Yeah.
Or, you know, or Jerry and the Pacemakers, but it's not. It's much more than that, isn't it? Because Johnny Marr's musicality, because of Morrissey's extraordinarily unique vocal approach and his lyrical approach, which seems to have been born out of watching, you know, British kitchen sink dramas. Again, we talk about short storytelling.
Yeah.
And funny. I think that's the thing people always forget about Morrissey. You know, they will say, oh, heaven knows I'm miserable now. How miserable can you get? Well, actually, that song is anything but miserable.
Yeah.
It's hilarious.
I agree. Girlfriend in a Coma, the same.
This is so funny, you know. It's a black humour. It's a very northern humour. But the Headmaster Ritual, what a fantastic way to
They're great. I think it's not only... I mean, you know, the thing is, it's what you said, the musicality, Marr, Rourke, and so on, they are great. They're really good, and they are players.
Yeah.
I think this is the thing that, you know, I was playing, actually, the Sisters of Mercy album, which I really, really like, but it's kind of got a monolithic sound. Although they use acoustics occasionally, and it varies, it's got a monolithic sound. This actually is all over the show. You can hear aspects of funk, aspects of 60s soul, aspects of, you know, great ballads of the 60s. But then you can also hear this kind of quite intricate 80s four-piece band making some great music. I mean, the title track, it's quite an experimental piece of music. There's quite a number of tracks that use sound effects as well. You know, I think they do sound of their age to a degree, but they really are players. You know, get a band, and I think people dismiss them because of what they saw as the monotonal Morrissey voice. But while I was listening to Morrissey, not only is he a remarkable lyricist and a vocalist who is 100% himself, unaffected, almost coming out of nowhere, he's really imaginative rhythmically.
Completely.
You know, he does some bizarre
melodically too.
playing and melodically, but also the way in which he plays on the rhythms of the complex music. And I was comparing that against an album that clearly was influenced by the Smiths this year, Love Not Money, on occasion. And I think Tracy Thorn's a great vocalist. But actually, she's not doing the acrobatics he's doing. You know, she's singing really nicely and really well, and there's some lovely melodies. But he's doing some extraordinary things.
Well, some of his melodies, that joke isn't funny anymore. What a melody. I mean, okay, the piece of music Johnny Marr created is stunning anyway.
Yeah.
But the way Morrissey finds the melodies is so him and so unique and so difficult to imitate, almost to the point that it seems like I think he is the definition of an idiot savant, is that he doesn't have any training, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's just doing it. He's doing Morrissey.
Lyrically and vocally.
And vocally. He's just doing Morrissey, and he's just a very, very unique individual. For good and bad, some of his politics I may not agree with, particularly these days. But songs like This Joke Isn't Funny Anymore, The Headmaster Ritual, Nowhere Fast, Meet His Murder, as you say, it's such a great body of work, isn't it? And what my favourite, I think we talked about this before, my favourite statistic about the Smiths is that in the time it took Yes to follow up 90125 with The Big Generator, 8 songs, the Smiths formed, released 4 albums, 2 compilations and about 20 singles, and broke up and certainly changed the face of alternative music.
Yeah.
I love that statistic. So very prolific. They were a true band, weren't they? They were a true band.
They were a true band.
That were misfits in a way, but that found a common ground that created something amazing.
But that's it, because, I love, we were saying Hounds of Love, what a beautiful mapped out album. But that is very much the vision of Kate Bush using the studio. Ditto songs from The Big Chair, Tears for Fears and Chris Hughes. This is a great band and a versatile band. Making some really interesting music. And I suppose what's great about the Smiths is partly because of Morrissey's uniqueness. They were difficult to place at the time. But if you're listening to some of the music, you can hear how Rourke might have been in a certain ratio style funk band before he was in the Smiths or something, or how Marr is drawing anything from Richard Thompson to hard rock in certain things as well.
And
as
Nile Rodgers.
Funk. Yeah.
Nile Rodgers is he called his son Nile apparently after Nile Rodgers. He's the world's biggest
There's
sheep
so many influences
in
there,
and
a great versatile
and then
player.
Morrissey's love of like 60s, manufactured pop icons like Sandy Shaw and Dusty Springfield. Not manufactured in case of those, but do you know what I mean?
A couple of the melodies you feel come from that.
Yeah. We love the Smiths, folk. We absolutely love the Smiths. And we, at least I think Tim also, I think you'd agree with me, we also love this band, the Waterboys. This is the Sea, their 3rd album. This is the album that has the hit on it, which is unfortunate in a way that the band are known, I think, by a lot of people only as for having this one hit, The Whole of the Moon. Yeah. Because I think their albums are amazing. And I think this is, including this album, it's an amazing record.
My favourites, I love, I love What Followed, but actually my favourite probably is A Pagan Place and this.
Love it. I love A Pagan Place and Fisherman's Blues, but yes. Yeah.
And this, I think, we were raving about Astral Weeks on the last, and it's definitely got the spirit of Astral Weeks in there. And I remember, I've read subsequently that he was influenced by minimalist composers. Weirdly enough, Steve Reich was a big influence on him during this period. But once more, especially the title track, he's doing that hypnotic Astral Weeks, playing 2 relatively obvious chords, but somehow managing to make them, stretch them into this spiritual wonderland.
Just getting lost in it. Yeah. Lost. I mean, the title track of A Pagan Place is similar to me, just the same chord sequence. And he's got an amazing voice, hasn't he? I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of, voices from this era that are perhaps underachieving voices. I think of, things, like Andy McCluskey from OMD, for example. Yeah. Not a great singer, but sort of charming in a way. Bernard Sumner, Barney from New Order. We talked about. He's got the voice, hasn't he, Mike Scott? He's got the voice to compete with your Van Morrisons. He's got the voice to channel that kind of spiritual, losing yourself in the music quality. The one thing I don't like so much about this record, which I like Pagan Place and the following album, Fisherman's Blues, a bit better, is it sounds a bit 1985 in the production. There's a lot more artifice in the fabric of the production to me, big reverbs on the drums and things like that. makes me like it slightly less.
I think it's mainly on the drums. I think the material
Yeah.
doesn't suffer. You know, possibly some of the keyboard sounds as well, but
Not so much, yeah. But yes, I mean, one of my favourite bands of the whole 80s. Brilliant singer. Don't Bang the Drum, The Pan Within, just great song.
How it does it, it transcends the artifice in the production because of his organic voice and because of that sense that, you know, he's seeking nirvana in the music, and you go with it every single step of the way. So
and for me, that's what makes him an old soul as well, is because I could easily have imagined him carving out this catalogue in the 70s too.
Yeah, well, you can hear how this could be a singer-songwriter who emerges alongside Tim Buckley and Van Morrison in the late 60s. He could have made it at that point.
Completely. So you mentioned Everything But the Girls' Love Not Money album. This is kind of their album where they're almost trying to be the Smiths, isn't it? I think that Ben Watt kind of admitted, you know, they were very much enthralled to...
It's a good album.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good.
And there's a few of the sort of the jazzy arrangements that come in that the Smiths would never do, some of the horn sections and so on. A couple of beautiful ballads, the one that Ben Watt sings, is it Sean or something?
One thing I like about Everything But the Girl is that every album has kind of got its own little personality, isn't it? You know, this is so different to their debut Eden, and then very different to like Idlewild, and so every album's got, and then obviously later on the drum and bass.
It is
records.
Almost every album is an album apart.
Which I love that about them.
And this was a good one, if not their best, but good.
Beautiful cover as well.
Yeah.